What's up guys, Bjorn here. I hope you're all doing great. I'm back today with a Tormented AFFIX guide. We're gonna take a look at all the different Tormentors and their powers. The DPS ones, which are pumping, the defensive ones, which are trash, which you never want to pick. We're also gonna take a look at all of the different Tormentors and how to fight them, and which ones you can skip if you want to do that. Now, I am coming at this from a DPS perspective, so if you're a tank or a healer, you might see some different powers to these. You can probably still take some things from this video, but just remember that you're gonna end up seeing some different ones that you might have to pick or not pick, depending on how good they sound to you. Before we get into the video, make sure you leave a like or subscribe maybe even, if you want to. Otherwise, stay tuned and we'll get straight into the video, guys. So, we are gonna start off with Soggydune here. The first boy, and he drops 3 defensive powers. We have the Dripping Fang, the Stone Ward, and the Tiny Dancing Shoes. And here we have pretty much one universal choice, the Stone Ward. It is just a really strong power. It is basically a copy of the Pride's Shield, if you remember that from back in Legion. It just does a solid amount of HPS, it saves you from one-shots, it helps your healer out. It's just a really strong power. So pretty much always take that. Now, there is one scenario in which you could consider Dancing Shoes, and that is if you are a melee player and it's Spiteful weak, which means that you might get hit by some Spitefuls here and there, then dodging 2 melee attacks in every single pull can be pretty decent actually. So don't sleep on the Tiny Dancing Shoes too much, but as you can see here, I've written 99% on the Stone Ward. Think it is the best choice in pretty much every single scenario. And when it comes to Dripping Fang, I would frankly never pick it if you're a DPS. I'm not sure if it might be good on like tanks or healers if they even have that, but for DPS, no, don't pick it. Moving on to the Frosty Boy then. We have Vial of Desperation, Regenerative Fungus, and Handbook of Uncivil Etiquette. And guys, I know you all want to pick the handbook, you all want to pump, right? And it isn't the worst power, especially if you're a melee player or maybe a shaman, you have a short CD interrupt that you're going to use a lot. And if you are in a dungeon where the bosses can be interrupted, or where there's like a large amount of big mobs that also can be interrupted, in which case you might get some really good value out of this power here. Now, the reality of the situation is you probably won't have that much uptime on this 10% damage increase, right? You might use your interrupt maybe 20 times, 25 times in a dungeon, 30 times if you're really high on the fingers, but even then, right, it's not going to be a massive amount of uptime. While as Vial of Desperation is something that will work every single time, and it's going to help your healer out a lot, it's going to save you from some one-shots maybe potentially. And if the key level is low, well, then you can pick Vial of Desperation to survive one-shots and get healed back up afterwards. If the key level is high, then Vial suddenly becomes really useful just for like usual unavoidable boss damage mechanics, right? Because taking 25% of your max health in one unavoidable damage hit is it's actually pretty likely in higher keys. So in that case, Vial of Desperation is also going to be really strong. If you feel, however, that you don't have use for any of these, and there are some scenarios where you won't have any use for either Vial or Handbook, I guess, then you could take Regenerative Fungus. It's not the worst, but overall, pretty bad power, in my opinion. So, moving on to the actual fun DPS powers then. We have Incinerator with the first power, Champion's Brand. We have Raging Battle Axe and Signet of Bolstering. And here, Champion's Brand is probably going to come out as about a 5% DPS increase for you. Now, this obviously depends on what stat you're getting, what spec you are, what dungeon you're in, how you're pulling, how you're doing your damage, etc, etc. But in most scenarios, as long as you're getting like a valuable stat here, which I assume you're getting since you're getting your highest stat out of Crit and Mastery, and one of those two are gonna be valuable for you, most likely. So if you're getting a valuable stat from Champion's Brand, might equate to about a 5% DPS increase. It's going to work on single target, it's going to work great on AoE, it's going to work in every scenario, right? Just a solid pick. When it comes to the Signet of Bolstering then, this is a pretty weird power because it's very hard to get any use out of it, since it procs when things are dying, and usually when things are dying you don't need to do a lot of damage, right, because you have already done your damage. But there are some scenarios in which it can work. For example, if you're in an explosive week, that means that explosives are going to spawn at the start of the pulse, which then proc Signet of Bolstering, and you can stack this up quite a bit on just the explosives, and then you'll have actually a pretty decent damage buff for the entire pack. And the damage buff from Signet of Bolstering is going to be a lot better than Raging Battle Axe and Champion's Brand if you can proc it effectively. But on the other hand, explosive is pretty much the only way to proc this effectively. Spiteful might work, but it's likely that it won't, because if you're thinking about a pack that's dying, you might have some mobs dying early. They're gonna start the Signet of Bolstering duration. Then maybe 10 seconds later, the last mob in the pack is gonna die, and then you still have 15 seconds left on your Signet. And then the Spitefuls are gonna spawn. They're gonna die slowly. And sure, some cases you might proc some Signet stacks on the tail end of the pool with those last Spitefuls, in which case you might carry on that buff into the next pack. But otherwise, it's pretty unlikely that you'll have a ton of Signet stacks going into any pool, even in Spiteful Week. So I would usually stay away from Signet of Bolstering, personally. Now, the Raging Battle Axe is a little bit more interesting, because it has a proc chance, right? It's gonna proc, the more haste you have, the more damage instances you do, the more the Raging Battle Axe is going to proc, which means it is really, really strong on some specs, namely like rogue specs, Frost Mage, Havoc DH, things with a lot of haste or a lot of damage instances procs this a lot, and it's going to be really strong. But it's also just effective under 30% HP, right? So if you're just blowing through the packs and bosses on a weekly 15, then you're probably not going to get a lot of value out of this compared to the Champion's Brand. But if you are, for example, in a high key where you're doing a ton of damage early on in the pool, then the mobs are dropping to 30% and you are suddenly out of cooldowns, but you still maintain your haste buff from I-Beam as a Havoc DH, or you still have Slice and Dice Blade Flurry up as an Outlaw Rogue, for example, then you're gonna keep proccing this Raging Battle Axe at 30%, and the value is actually gonna skyrocket at that point, right? If you're a Frost Mage, you drop the Orb with Blizzard, and you have a ton of Ice Lances going in, a ton of damage instances without a lot of globals, right? So really strong value there. Also, it might be pretty good on bosses compared to Champion's Brand, right? If you are spending a lot of time in that 30% part of the boss, then Raging Battle Axe can start stacking up a bit in terms of damage. But even then, on single target, I think it's going to be probably at least comparable to Champion's Brand, right? Even if you're good at proccing it. So, moving into the last boy, Executioner Verruth. Here we have 3 really strong powers. We have Volcanic Plume, Champion's Brand again, and then we have Dagger of Necrotic Wounding. And starting off with Champion's Brand, it's the exact same thing as last time, right? It's just a solid 5% DPS increase, more or less. And the only thing to keep in mind is that if you've already picked one of them, then the next one might be a little bit less effective, because you might run into that diminishing returns part of the stat above 30%. But it's never going to be a huge deal, right? 2 Champion's Brands are good. I usually pick them on my Warlock pretty much every single time. So definitely still a solid thing to pick both of them. Now, the other 2, however, are really, really useful. And the first one is Volcanic Plume, or Volcanic Plumage. It basically just creates an AoE under the mobs that knocks them up and does fire damage to everything. And it's uncapped. So, similar to Raging Battle Axe, this has a proc chance, right? The more damage instances you're doing, the more this thing is going to proc. So, things like, now I'm going to harp on about this again, but I'm just going to pick Frost Mage here as an example again, right? You are placing your Blizzard, your Frozen Orb, you're tunneling the mob or the packs with Ice Lances, you're slowing everything by 50%, and you also have this Volcanic Plume that is going to proc continuously over and over again under all of the mobs, and it's going to knock up every single mob in that pack, doing a large amount of fire damage, right? A significant amount of fire damage, considering its mass AoE here. So on AoE pools, I think Volcanic Plume is going to outperform Champion's Brand and Dagger in terms of damage pretty much every single time, especially if you can proc it well. Now, even if you can't proc it well, it's probably still going to do a decent amount of AoE damage, right? But if you can proc it well, Volcanic Plume is amazing. And not only does it do a large amount of damage, it also cancels all of the uninterruptible casts that the mobs are doing, like AoEs, for example. And it can also interrupt spells, right, that you can't catch with your usual interrupt. So the CC value of Volcanic Plume is actually also through the roof. And I would normally recommend to have like at least one Volcanic Plume in pretty much all dungeons, right? Maybe not all dungeons, but most dungeons where you're pulling big, especially if it's fortified, especially if the mobs are casting a lot, I would definitely suggest picking at least one Volcanic Plume. Scenarios where this is really strong is, for example, the Mist's Maze. Those mobs in there are casting a lot, all of them, right? Both uninterruptible spells and interruptible spells. So having one or two Volcanic Plumes in there to cancel all those while kiting them is going to be super strong. Also, for example, in the Ardenweald section of the other side, where you're going to pull really, really big, having Volcanic Plumes to help your tank out and just seeing those mobs so that they don't melee him as much is going to be extremely useful. But the last power of Executioner Varuth is also a very, very strong one. We have the Dagger of Necrotic Wounding, and similarly to Volcanic Plume and Raging Battle Axe, this thing can also proc, right? It has a proc chance, so the more haste you have, the more damage resistance, the better it is. And it's going to stack up on a target up to 10 times, doing a physical dot that reduces healing and absorption. So you can imagine this is really, really strong on single target bosses, especially, right, where you're just gonna pummel the same mob over and over again. Now, even if it's not a tyrannical boss, it might still be a good pick. In, for example, Theater of Pain, it's pretty powerful, or in dungeons where you have few but large mobs, right? Now, if it is tyrannical weak, I'm probably always gonna end up picking Dagger of Necrotic Wounding, because it usually ends up doing about from anywhere from like 9 to 13% of my single target damage on bosses, and having a 10% damage increase on bosses is just going to be way better than what Champion's Brand and Volcanic Plume can provide here. Which means that if it is tyrannical, I'm always picking Dagger, more or less, right? Similarly, if it's fortified and you're doing like huge pulls, then Volcanic Plume is probably both going to do more damage, but also going to allow for some really good CC abilities, right, compared to Dagger. So in this scenario, I would probably pick Volcanic Plume most of the time. And then you have those like medium keys where it's like maybe a 15 and it's maybe a fortified key, but there isn't really a ton of big pulls, so you don't need to pick Volcanic Plume. Then you can also always just pick Champion's Brand for a solid DPS increase, right? So here is probably the most dynamic selection of all of them with Executioner Varuth. All of these three are going to be useful in some different scenarios depending on what class you are and what dungeon you're playing, with what affixes, right? Okay, so after going through all of the powers, I figured we'd also just talk a little bit about fighting these guys and then also skipping them if you would want to do that. So these 4 different boys have different auras, right? And the soggydune one is a 50% physical damage taken. The Frost Boy, as I'm sure you noticed, is a 50% movement speed slow. The Fire Boy is continuous ticking damage when you're fighting him, and the Executioner is a 50% healing reduction for your entire party. Now, if you decide to skip any of these guys, then that aura will come onto the last boss and be present during the entire boss encounter of the last boss, right? The mob itself will not be there. You won't have to deal with him, but you will have to deal with the aura that he provides, right? And this means that a 50% physical damage is manageable, right, if you want to skip him. A 50% movement speed can also be manageable, but a continuous fire ticking damage is going to be pretty rough for your healer, and a 50% healing reduction taken is also going to be pretty rough for your healer. So usually skipping Incinerator and Varuth is not advisable, not only because they do a ton of damage with their auras, but also because you'll also lose out on the damage powers themselves by not killing them, right? While as soggydune and Frosty Boy are a little bit more skippable, since they have comparatively pretty bad powers and they're also easier auras, right? Out of Soggydune and the Frosty Boy, I would recommend skipping the Frosty Boy pretty much every time, because he has worse powers and the aura is easier if your players can dodge spells while 50% slowed, right? Now, if there isn't a lot of physical damage going out on the last boss, if it's mainly just tank damage, then yeah, Soggydune might be fine. Your healer can keep up with that 50% damage increase taken on the tank, and if your tank plays it well, then skipping Soggydune as well can definitely be a play to do if you want to save a lot of time. Generally, however, I would advise killing all of these most of the time, right? Especially if you're just doing general 15s, you don't really have that time pressure, then just killing all of them is gonna end up being the best play most of the time. So in terms of the actual mechanics of the mobs then, well, you've probably already dealt with all of these yourself. The Soggydune boy just grips you in, right? You can use those bindings to funnel him if you have any funnel in your spec, for example, Fan of Knives Eviscerate on Rogue or something like that. The Frosty boy is not really much to think about either. Just make sure you don't run into your teammates with a Frost debuff, please. Incinerator, similar again, really easy. Make sure you interrupt early though, so that you don't overlap a ton of interrupts in the group, because letting that cast go through is pretty nasty. Executioner has some more tech. You can, for example, immune the charge if you shadow meld, feign death, or anything like that. You have to do it right when he's almost on top of you and about to spin though, so it can be pretty tough to do. You can also just immune the charge by any other means, right? And you also have to stack for the fear, right? So either you can stack all players in melee, or you can stack like ranged with the healer in ranged and the melee players in melee. Doesn't really matter. Alright, to summarize the powers then, well, Soggydune, you pick the Stone Ward pretty much every single time. Frosty Boy, I would suggest Vial of Desperation, but you can obviously pick Handbook as well if you want the DPS. Incinerator, I would pick Champion's Brand on pretty much every spec, but Battle Axe can be good as well. And Executioner Veruth is the one with the most nuance. It's gonna depend on the key, the affixes, and your spec. But Champion's Brand is never a bad choice, right? And otherwise, Dagger on Tyrannical, Volcanic on Fortified is a pretty good baseline. Alright guys, I hope you really enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you want to see more content like this. And otherwise, just have a great day. See ya.